Well, hey there, how you doing? It's Amin here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me today. I want to talk about that Wall Street Journal article that showed up a couple of weeks ago, June 6, 2025, allegedly showing us that a lot of ideas about UFOs, UAP, programs, and so forth come out of some sort of Pentagon disinformation program. The article was called "The Pentagon Disinformation That Fueled America's UFO Mythology. U.S. military fabricated evidence of alien technology and allowed rumors to fester to cover up real secret weapons programs." Well, so here's the thing about this article. I mean, as you know, you probably watched some of my videos before, maybe a long time on my YouTube channel. I'm totally open to different points of view on any of these subjects. I'm always willing to admit, maybe I'm wrong about some of these topics. We learn new evidence. But I have to say, in the case of this Wall Street Journal article, this is not an article that really showed me all that much that was new about the topic. It certainly didn't change my view overall about what the phenomena are and the reality of these phenomena, because we've been hearing for quite a while about Pentagon disinformation programs. As you know, a number of years ago, I interviewed Richard Doty at the UFO MegaCon in Laughlin, Nevada. I believe it was in 2019. And he clearly admitted there being involved in disinformation programs to make people believe that the things they were seeing were UFOs, to really cover up secret Air Force programs, drone technology, drones around Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, where he worked at the time, and other sorts of programs like that. But the amazing thing about that interview with Rick is he says that the phenomena itself is actually real, and that these disinformation programs are designed to cover up that the phenomena really exists. And I think this is where the Wall Street Journal article falls short, at least just logically. Because if you just think about it for a second, and I'm confining my comments here to the first article on June 6th, not the follow-up article on June 21st about arts parts and the extraterrestrial materials and so forth. Just about these disinformation programs for a moment. I mean, just because disinformation programs exist, Rick Doty told us they exist, it's not that much of a surprise to learn that there were more programs like this, even kept hidden for decades. The fact that these programs don't contradict the reality of all the other witnesses that we've heard from, hundreds and thousands of witnesses, citizen hearing that I went to in 2013 at National Press Club for 5 days, listening to many witnesses who've encountered these phenomena, from the military, pilots, aerospace professionals, and so forth. So it's just illogical. The argument is from the Wall Street Journal article that this Yankee Blue disinformation program, classified program to make people think that UFOs existed within the Pentagon, maybe as a way of hazing them or just testing for loyalty. The fact that such a program exists, and maybe hundreds of people encountered this program and saw a photo of something that looked like a UFO or something like that, and then we're told, you can never talk about it, sign this NDA. Even if such a thing exists, it doesn't mean that the phenomena itself isn't real. I've talked to many people over the years, as I've written about in Black Swan Ghosts, witnesses I've encountered who've actually handled these allegedly NHI materials, non-human intelligence materials, who've told me, and none of them were from the Pentagon. These were all aerospace engineers who worked for private companies or for NASA. And like in chapter 19, I talked about someone named Phil, who I've met at a lot of conferences over the years, who was very upfront talking about his team at a company that he worked for, an aerospace company, being asked, I believe it was by JPL, to examine materials, and they were told, his team was told, oh, the people who made it went away. We don't know how it works. And Phil told me he was 100% confident, as was everyone on his team, that this was not a human-made type of technology. It was so advanced that they figured there's just no way, and probably for many other reasons, that it can be made on Earth. And this is, I've had this sort of conversation with so many aerospace engineers. Some of them have signed NDA, so I haven't really brought them forward, but what they've told me is exactly what Phil was telling me, is that they know of these programs within the companies they work for, even if they were just working on classified aircraft technologies with special materials that could allow the aircraft to withstand very high speeds and so forth. They told me that these were materials on planes that would take half an hour to get up to these very high speeds, Mach 20 or something like this. Kind of like the Tic Tac and the Nimitz incident. But it would take half an hour to get to that speed, not instantaneous right angle turns and so forth, and instantaneous velocity changes. But they were aware of these UFO material programs. And I did talk about another witness who I've made some videos about. This, I believe, is in chapter 27. And this is in the revised edition, chapter 27. Of this computer engineer who told me he believed he had handled material from the Roswell crash. And it's not like, he was told it's from the Roswell crash, kind of like a Yankee Blue deception, and to see if he would talk about it. He just sort of pieced this together. He said it could have been from some other crash, but these materials, he said, were engineered at an atomic level scale, which we don't know how to do yet. It's a tiny quantum level of engineering, atom by atom. And the materials were developed in a zero-G environment, and the isotopic proportions of the chemical elements were not the proportions you would find, the isotopic ratios. You wouldn't find those on Earth. He said it had to be from some other part of our galaxy or farther away, because those isotopic ratios don't naturally exist on Earth in the elements that these materials were made of. So he said this material he looked at, he said it was about a 3-foot section of a curved hull. He estimated the craft might have been 100 to 150 feet in diameter based on the curvature of the single piece he got to examine, 3 feet across. That this technology was 1,000 years ahead of our own technology. So this has nothing to do with Yankee Blue or anything like that. These are scientific and professional engineers who've been asked to look at these materials. And every time I have this conversation with someone like this, it's always the same sort of thing. And they haven't talked to anyone else. They've signed NDAs. And I've also talked to people who've worked in the OSAP program, the Aerospace Advanced Weapons Special Applications Program that later became something like ATIP, as the story goes. And those people, when I've asked them, and remember, this is the government's own program started by Reed, Inouye, and Ted Stevens of Alaska, to kind of get a handle on what these craft might be and the materials that they're made of and so forth, involving research at Skinwalker Ranch and so forth. These people in OSAP, anytime I asked them about these materials, we quickly got into an area where they said it was classified and they couldn't talk about it. So these are people that worked in OSAP. Presumably they would know a lot about what these material and craft, how they, how the videos they've seen of them, the materials and so forth. This doesn't have anything to do with the Wall Street Journal article. So I just think that it's the first part of that article. It just seems to me like, I called it, I think in one of my Twitter X comments today, like one-dimensional reporting. They're just looking at one program. These programs have existed from time to time. We've heard about other classified programs, Kona Blue, for example, which was going to be an extension of OSAP. That we've seen the declassified versions of the proposal, but the program was never completed. There are all sorts of programs out there. We recently heard about this one called Immaculate Constellation from what was it? Matt Brown, I think his name was. IMCON, the short name for this sort of classified government server internet system, JWIX system, this classified government internet system, which was like an AI large language model for UFO photos and images and so forth, where you could look these things up. And I think what Matt said is he was astounded by the amount of material, the things you could see in this AI special access program to compilate lots of UFO sightings and encounters and evidence. So we just have all these different sources that I think the Wall Street Journal should have mentioned. I just don't think this is good reporting, guys. It's just kind of BSing us. If you're going to do something like this, it should be more like the New York Times article from 2017. It just be a little more comprehensive. If you're just narrowly focused on one program, say, aha, this explains the whole thing. I mean, that's just not very convincing. It's just too superficial. And there's just too much evidence and too many witnesses, some of whom I've just mentioned, that don't have anything to do with that particular special disinformation program. Now, I have to say, what they were talking about probably does exist. I'm sure it exists. I just came back from the Cosmic Summit Conference in Greensboro, North Carolina, a few days ago. And Micah Hanks, who, has his own podcast and is a contributor to the Debrief website, which has a lot of interesting science and UFO and technology types of reporting and articles. He told us of a very interesting case where someone called his podcast once who had served in the 101st Airborne. And this individual said, I got to tell you what you're talking about, UFOs and crashed UFOs, is real, because we were shown a photo once of a crash retrieval site, and we were told not to talk about it. And we had to sign an NDA and so forth, so I know what you guys are talking about is real. And then what Micah told us is, a couple days later, someone else called in and said, I'm not going to identify who I am or what my particular responsibilities were, but it had something to do with the 101st Airborne, and I can tell you what that individual who called in was talking about was a program that we set up to test the loyalty of different individuals with security credentials who had access to classified materials to see if they were leaking this information or not, right? So we would show them different images of crash sites, allegedly just fabricated crash sites, from different angles. And if that information kind of leaked around in the UFO community, then we would know which individuals had been leaking that information. So what that person was talking about is real, but it's a program that was designed as a loyalty test to see if people were trustworthy, if they would honor their NDAs that they would sign with the government. So, you can kind of understand that. It would sort of make sense. You'd want to sort of see if you had information that you wanted to remain secret, you could kind of test it that way. So that's very interesting. But again, that doesn't answer all the other questions and issues we have. So many people that have seen this debris, who've seen the crash sites, who've seen these UFO, UAP, NHI vehicles on the ground. There have been so many people that have been witnesses to this over the years. I mean, just think of Rendlesham Forest, Burroughs and Penniston just being one one example of this. I'm just familiar with that from the citizen hearing and so forth because they were there and testified and so forth. So I think the reasoning here in the Wall Street Journal article, I mean, it's kind of like this. This is why it doesn't make sense. You're probably aware that during World War II, the Allies had these sort of fake platoons and battalions of tanks and things like this, which I believe were made of balsa wood, if I'm not mistaken, or I think some of them were inflatable. And it was designed to confuse the Nazi military, of what were the real, real weapons, the real tanks, real boats, and so forth, and what were fakes. And so, we've seen this sort of thing before, but just because they're inflatable and balsa wood tanks that the Allies are using before D-Day in World War II, that doesn't mean that there weren't real tanks and real boats. And this is the same logical fallacy that the Wall Street Journal is committing, in my view. I'm sure what the name of this logical fallacy is, but it's a pretty big one. It's just because X exists doesn't mean that Y also doesn't exist, okay? Maybe X exists, maybe it doesn't exist. Your disinformation program doesn't mean that the phenomena itself overall isn't real. It's just silly. So the second part of the Wall Street Journal article concerns Bob Salas, the Maelstrom missile incursion incidents of 1967, which you're familiar with, the so-called Northern Tier SAC base incidents where UFOs came over these different bases, all in the kind of the northern tier of the U.S. and in other locations, and neutralized the batteries of missiles, sometimes 10 at a time, as happened at Maelstrom in 1967 at I believe it was the Echo and Oscar flights that Bob Salas has talked about. Now, what the Wall Street Journal said this was some secret EMP testing weapon, which, a system to test the resilience of missiles to EMP interference. And apparently Sean Kirkpatrick told this to Schechtman and Viswanathan, the authors of this article. There's so many problems with that explanation. It probably existed, we're told, by Christopher Mellon, former Defense Department official, in his rebuttal to the Wall Street Journal articles, that this EMP testing device, which was like 60 feet high and it kind of glowed orange when it was turned on, had these wires that went down into the missile launch tubes and so forth, that this system existed, but it didn't exist in 1967. It was a couple of years later. This is not going to explain the Bob Salas Maelstrom event of 67 if the device didn't exist at the time. It's perfectly conceivable that Kirkpatrick just got his dates wrong here. But even if such a thing did exist, it doesn't explain what happened at Minot Air Force Base. David Schindele, remember his experience showing up. This is another, Salas is a missile launch control officer, same thing with Schindele. And he's told, Joel never talk, shows up at work one day, all the missiles are down. There had been reports of UFOs in the news that morning. He went into the command capsule and he was told that they had been around the launch control facilities. So this is not a static object sitting 60 feet above the base. And of course, wouldn't you expect the security guards to notice such a thing? Apparently these things were like the size of like 5 semi-trucks in width. You would see the construction. You would see this thing over 60 feet over the base. This is just silly. And it happened at other places. In Loring, Maine, we've had some of the pilots there talk who were scrambled to look at those objects. These are objects that are flying around over the base. And in the case of Maelstrom, they glowed red. The guard called down to the launch control officers below ground and said, "Sir, it's 100. It's over the gate. What do I do?" His voice is shaking. Salas was told never to talk about it, and I heard him speak once. He said his biggest regret was never contacting this guy again and trying to console him a little bit because, these security guards are really shaken up by what they saw. This isn't a glowing orange round sphere just staying still. It's a big object moving over the base. It happened at Wurtsmith in Maine, and then, of course, it happened in other countries because talked to Dr. Richard Hoover, also in Black Swan Ghosts, who had worked at NASA, and he had talked to Dr. Komakov from the USSR on this exchange program once, who had told him about the Bielo-Korovich incident in Ukraine in '82, back then part of the Soviet Union, when a large object, he said 150 feet across, came over the base and initiated the launch sequence. Down, we're told, something like 20 seconds to launch. This is coming from someone that was in charge of the Soviet nuclear program. I think they would know if this is some sort of EMP test. So Salas wrote a very good rebuttal to the Wall Street Journal. You should definitely find it. I will link it below in the description. But it's just silly to think that you would take live nuclear armed missiles and inject them with huge amounts of energy just to see what would happen. That would be completely reckless. How do you know what would happen? Would it cause them to launch? Would it cause an explosion to happen? We don't know. And of course, they wouldn't do such a thing without notifying the base commanders, Strategic Air Command. And Salas said that when they were, Strategic Air Command talked about this later, they didn't mention anything about a test. It's just incomprehensible. You wouldn't let your missile control launch officers with their fingers on the button who can start World War III, that you were about to do such a test. And then across all these different bases, and it doesn't fit what the witnesses saw. So anyway, I think you can tell how I feel about this article. This is very typical of modern journalism. I wrote my PhD dissertation in sociology about this a number of years ago, about how journalism was getting increasingly superficial and lacked historical depth, mainly due to this sort of more kind of instantaneous communication we have nowadays, which kind of creates a more, flattened perception of time. And this article from the Wall Street Journal just kind of fits this to a T. I mean, I'm totally open to the idea that these things existed, but to try to explain all of these different cases with just these narrow explanations, it doesn't make sense. This isn't how we do research, okay? You have to explain all of the data. You can't just explain 5% of it and say, okay, we explained, and the rest of the 95%, well, whatever. It's not going to wash, okay? So I'm not sure if this is just some sort of backlash from the national security state trying to whitewash this topic once again. Maybe it is. I just think it's a case of just superficial, one-dimensional research. Anyway, that's my ideas about it. I'm always interested in hearing your point of view. Feel free to put your comments in the box below. We'll see you in the next video. Take care for now, and bye.